And I think for some people, or like traditional horror people, it's like a slower pace, or it's like not as like, you need propulsion, you need action in every single thing. And I think that with Indigenous horror, it's quieter in some horror elements in that way, but like really explosive in emotional horror.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thank you all for being here in this wind and crazy March weather. And I'm so happy to get a chance to speak with you. I already know we're going to go over time, so somebody's going to have to jump up and down and, and tell us to stop. So just to start, if you could give us just a little overview of the novel and the themes that it explores, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here. It is really exciting to be a part of in-person events again, and just to connect with people and see people in person, and to have the opportunity to chat to you is so fantastic. So Bad Cree is my debut novel. It follows a Cree millennial woman who one day wakes up and realizes that she can bring things back and forth with her from her dreams. And these happenings are actually quite terrifying. Her dreams slowly start turning into nightmares, and these nightmares have very real life consequences. Not knowing what to do, she returns home to her home territory and her family, a place and people she has been separated from for a number of years. And she goes to her aunties and her mom and her sister and her cousin for help. And they have to overcome a lot to sort of band together. There's a lot of family complexities that that they've all suffered losses in their families, and have complex relationships with each other. And despite those things, they come together to try and figure out what this force is that's descending upon them all. I think at its heart, Bad Cree is about family, and it's about love, and it's about kinship and relationships and responsibility. And I hope that it is also propulsive and kind of spooky and scary.
Thank you for that. So many things I want to follow up on from that, but I understand that you were in a creative writing program out at UBC, and I'm now teaching creative writing at University of Toronto Scarborough campus.
Oh my God, congratulations.
Thank
That's
you
amazing.
very much. So what I wanted to ask you about was your experience in creative writing programs as an Indigenous woman, as a Cree woman. And I know that it had an effect on you that actually contributed to the creation of this novel. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so I was completing my MFA at the University of British Columbia. And at the time, there actually weren't any Indigenous creative writing professors. So, which was difficult in many ways, I think, because I think I came up against a lot of barriers in terms of the kinds of stories I wanted to tell, and also the way I wanted to tell them. I think academia really loves like highbrow, like literary fiction, which isn't to say there's anything wrong with that. I think there's some great literary fiction, and it's also not what I felt compelled to write. I really love genre. I really love genre blending also. And so there were many times where I really felt I was at odds with sort of a colonial institution, and my own worldviews or my own understandings of how story works and how story plays into our lives. And this particular incident you're talking about is, I was in a creative writing class, and my professor had sort of given the advice to never write about your dreams. And yeah, you know, he claimed it was because it would lose your reader, that readers would find dreams very boring, and so just not to do it. And that just like really, again, it wasn't the first time I'd really come up against these things, but it was one of the times, like he wouldn't have even thought about this. I doubt he thinks about this at all. But it really stuck with me because I was raised to really value and trust in dreams. For Cree people, dreams are incredibly important to how we communicate with our ancestors, to how we generate knowledge, it's our connection to the stars. We're star people. It's our connection to story, which is also the stars. And I just, it felt bad to be in a place of learning and to be given advice that went entirely against what I had been brought up to understand. So because I'm an Aries and I'm a fire sign, I said, I'm going to write a story that is entirely about dreams, and it's not going to be boring. It's going to be one that all different people of all kinds of backgrounds will find interesting and exciting. So I wrote a short story called Bad Cree, which was published in Grain magazine and then went on to win the 2020 Writers' Trust Journey Prize. And I expanded that story into this novel because apparently my revenge knows no bounds. And it just, I wanted to center dreams, and I wanted to center the importance of them. And I hope I did that.
Success is such sweet revenge, isn't it?
It's also a dish best served cold because
Yes,
it took a long time. So,
right, I can imagine. In my teaching, I'm trying to, come from a place of being anti-racist, decolonial, and it's really challenging at times because even the students sometimes resist it. They're used to certain ways of doing things and looking at things. So I wanted to ask you what you would have been looking for as an Indigenous writer in this colonial institution, and maybe what you observed of other, students, BIPOC students, and maybe what they were looking for and not getting. What would you want to see in a creative writing program for Indigenous people especially?
Yeah, you know what? I had some really great mentors and profs at UBC as well. One of them, her name is Sharita Warner. She's a poet. And what I really loved about her was her deep interest in pedagogy and understanding, even though she's a white poet as well, and she understood that people's processes were different and different methodologies work for different people. So she was really committed to incorporating that mindset into her curriculum. So she would try all different kinds of ways of engaging students, and some of them were really worked really well in classes, and some of them didn't. But she was not afraid of trying. And I think one of the things I really needed as an Indigenous student was someone to try and meet me where I was at, which was, first of all, I don't think it's very helpful to give hard and fast rules about writing ever. They're just...
Which isn't a hard and fast rule.
Yeah. Even that, throw that out the window. Give hard and fast rules all the time. I think...
I'm an Anishinaabe. I have to tease you. It's compulsory.
I feel like it's always the niche people in my life that will tease me the most, and Cree people love to tease. So that is a really high compliment to niche people that I know.
Exactly.
So I think because also, your Indigenous students, because some of them, might be Anishinaabe, some of them might be Cree, they're very different, and then their own backgrounds and their experiences will be different. So I think there isn't a blanket, like, this will work for all Indigenous students, because, as you know, we're all very different. But what I think I needed and what I really appreciated was the opportunity in my other classes that worked really well for me, gave me the opportunity to meet me where I was at, to see the things that I was really interested in, that I really wanted to write, and encourage that. And Sharita was incredibly encouraging with the things that I wanted to focus on and how I wanted to write. She found works that were kind of doing the same thing that I was, or similar to what I was doing, or in line with what I wanted to do, and she borrowed these books to me so I could learn in that way as well. So yeah, I think that you care so much about wanting to do good by your students is like the very first thing. So yeah.
So she basically helped give you some tools to serve up that dish of cold revenge.
Yes, she did.
Awesome.
She was like, here's a plate and the fork and knife. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So I wanted to ask you, because I know that you've mentioned it in other interviews as well, and some people might not really know what you mean. When you're talking about like antis and anti energy in the book, tell us what you're referring to there.
Yeah, so, this book is really centered a lot around aunties. So the very first person Mackenzie, our protagonist, calls when these things start happening to her is her Auntie Doreen, before her mom, before her sister. And when she returns home, her Auntie Doreen and her Auntie Verna really... They don't know what's going on either. Like, they have absolutely no clue, but they will do absolutely everything to help her. Whatever tools they have at their disposal, they're hers. And Mackenzie's mom in the story is an aunt to her cousin, and so the ways that these aunties love the next generation of women coming up after them is so fierce. And that's the kind of auntie love that I really wanted to show, because that's how my aunties are. My aunties are how I learned governance. They're how I learned how to navigate conflict. They're how I learned to organize, by watching them. We have 1 million family members, as any Indigenous family does. And family get-togethers wouldn't happen without everything they do. They make sure everyone has a place to sleep. They make sure everybody has food. They make sure everybody feels as loved as like the cousin next to you, even though you're one of 1 million. And I think that's so powerful. I think that the power in being able to love that hard is so beautiful. And that's that kind of energy, this like fierce love energy, is that's auntieship to me. And I think Mackenzie finds that with other people in her life as well, not just her blood relatives, but Jolie, her friend in Vancouver, really her only kinship tie in Vancouver, before she returns home. They're incredibly protective over Mackenzie, and they are also fierce in their love. And, that's auntie energy too, even though they're not like blood related. And I think that's really important. And I think that regardless of your background, like when I say auntie energy, like, exactly what I'm talking about, So I think it transcends. Like, I think people have those people in their lives that like know exactly what that is.
And it points also to a different way of considering kinship, right? Which I think figures so prominently in the book. Because there is kind of the book is looking also at a kind of individualism. The protagonist is very avoidant of, the things that are going on back home and in her family and the losses that she suffered. And when we say auntie in English, but it's different the way that we, at least in Anishinaabe, and I think for Cree culture as well, that aunties play such an important role that it's not exactly the same as maybe what people know of as aunties, and so that the way that we think of kinship is so completely different. And so I found in the book there's this way of looking at cultural differences in ways that, it's not in your face, but there's, that individualism, which is so lauded in mainstream culture, is not helpful in this book. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, Mackenzie is incredibly avoidant. They all have very different trauma responses and responses to, and they're all at different stages of grief as well. And Mackenzie is certainly, very avoidant in her approach to conflict and her approach to, anything that could potentially harm her. And she also has this thing where she keeps thinking to herself, like, I need to be able to do this alone. Mm. Like, I shouldn't need your help, and also I don't want to burden you. And this very individualist idea. And it also plays into why she leaves in the first place. There's that, and also she's like, I want to strike it out on my own. Like, we see in a lot of pop culture and media of the individual going off and you become your own person. And that's not really a concept for Crees. You find yourself by knowing your role in community and knowing it well. And it's tied to everything else. It's a web, so it's also how your tie to community is also like how accountability is measured and how it happens. It's also how you remain taken care of. It's also how you know how to take care of other people. And it's really important. It's so important that that you remain a part of community through, problems, through conflict. And it takes her a bit to learn that, I think. I think she has unlearning to do in thinking about the way that, society portrays the individual, and also how she inherently knows community to be.
And so essential to the healing of the grief that pervades, especially the early part, but really throughout the novel. Grief is almost like a character. It's so dominant, such a dominant aspect of the book, which I found really interesting as well, because in some ways there are horror elements to the book. But I think, again, when we're thinking about horror, it's not really that, in a way, because it engages with so many of these other questions around family and kinship and grief and healing, and what is our role within our communities and so on. Predominant right now.
Yes.
And so in terms of Indigenous horror, I think that's what I'm seeing a lot of in other Indigenous horror. And so have you thought, I don't know, do you really, have you thought about, Indigenous horror, and how would you explain to somebody how Indigenous horror might be different from maybe what they normally would think of as horror stories?
I don't know. I agree. I think there's some really, really exciting work that has come out and that is coming out by Indigenous people that have horror elements or are strictly horror. And I do think that it's different from traditional horror. And in fact, I've had a lot of people, be like, this isn't really horror. And, when I think about that, I think, well, that it's not horror in how the traditionally that genre was made by a very specific people who have said this is what it is and this is what it isn't. And as an Indigenous person writing horror, I'm never going to fit into that. An Indigenous queer person writing horror, like there's a lot of intersections that make my understanding of the world very different to that. I think also that in a lot of ways, because also the book, there's always like this undercurrent element that the family is always facing, which is the violence of colonialism, which is extraction that is happening on their home territories, on their land. They're faced with all kinds of violence at in different ways. And that is really horrific. I can't think of something more horrible than the fact that your family, the legacy of your family, is surviving genocide. Like, that's horror in itself. So that is the background of every single character. To me, I'm like, how can that not be horror? That is, broadly the most horrific. So I think then what happens with Black and Indigenous people and people of color who are writing into horror is it's this, like, we've experienced all these things, these really horrible things happen all the time, and now we're writing about, whatever they're writing into. And in my case, it's, I would say, like, feelings. I write about big feelings: grief, joy, happiness, family, love. Like, I write about, and maybe that's what I should call it, is like, I write feelings horror, or like emotional horror. Emotional horror. I'm gonna coin that. And I think that's often when I'm reading other works of horror by Indigenous people, I'm thinking, like, there's so much complexity in the emotional side of the novel. And I think for some people, or like traditional horror people, it's like a slower pace, or it's like not as, like, you need propulsion, you need action in every single thing. And I think that with Indigenous horror, it's quieter in some horror elements in that way, but like really explosive in emotional horror. So as I was rambling on just now, I was like, that's what it is. Because I didn't have an answer at the start of this question, and I was like, oh yeah, that's what it is. That's the difference. That's the major difference I see. And I just, while we're talking about Indigenous horror, really want to plug Alicia Elliott's And Then She Fell, which is a novel coming out in September. And I have to, because this is Haudenosaunee territory, and she's a Haudenosaunee writer, and I gotta give it up for her. She's absolutely amazing. And I'm reading an advanced reading copy of it right now, and it is absolutely stunning. I'm really close to being done, and when you are taking something in that you really, really love and you don't want it to end, so you like postpone like reading it or watching it. That's what I'm doing right now, just because I don't want it to end. It's amazing. So put it on your
Do you have it with you?
I have it not with me. It's in my hotel room.
Oh, okay. So I can't like borrow it. from
Sorry.
you.
Sorry.
It would be a bit of Indigenous horror, me like accosting you in the hallway to try and get that book away from you. Alicia's great. I love her, and I'm looking forward to reading that book as well. So the other thing I noticed about Indigenous horror, and it's not that I've read a huge amount of it, is that what normally people would think of as the horror elements of it are not the real horror, as you were alluding to earlier. That it's not so much the ghost or the cannibal or the, those monster type figures, because those are in our stories, like our traditional stories, right? So we kind of have learned to live with them, I think, in a way. So what other people consider the horror elements of the story are not necessarily what we consider the horror, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting because some elements of it, we'll kind of be like, oh, that's not that bad. Like, oh, there's a ghost. Is it a friendly one or are they mean? Like, there's just like more, there's some interesting things to sort of tease out of it in ways that like, and there's, I think, really popular horror or, I think of like The Handmaid's Tale, this idea of, people who can reproduce, having their bodily autonomy taken away from them. And like for Indigenous people who have had forced sterilization, who have, had their children taken from them and had their bodily autonomy taken away in many, many ways over many, many years in different systems of oppression and violence, they're like, yes, that's a horror story. And it's something we've lived through. So there's like this, that's not as post-apocalyptic as some people might see it to be, as that's an actual reality. There's other ways that we interpret and think about horror.
Was it Cherie who said we don't really write apocalyptic fiction because we've already been through the apocalypse?
Did she? That sounds like
think
something she would
it
say.
sounds like her.
She's very
So
smart.
Maybe it was her. And you were talking earlier a little bit about kind of that extractive element that Indigenous people live with, and that is an element that is happening in the book, and I'm really trying hard not to throughout this interview. So, but that idea of extraction and like extraction from the land, did you choose sort of the oil industry to discuss that in the book?
Yeah, so Mackenzie is living away. She's living in Vancouver, and she returns to her home territory, which is in Treaty 8 in Alberta. And it is, the fictive present of the novel is, it's ambiguous, but it's within a time of cell phones with GPS and stuff like that, so you can kind of place it within the past 15 years or whatever. Because of that, you can't talk about Alberta without talking about the effects the oilfield industry has had on those lands. I don't think, even in a world that I make up in my head, I'm talking about my home territory in it, and it would be disingenuous if I didn't. And there's a very complex, people who live there have a very complex relationship with these industries, because they, have these, companies have come into these places, and they have, in many ways, allowed people and Indigenous communities to become, it's the main source of jobs. It's the main source of how people are able to feed themselves and their family. So there's a lot of people associated with that industry. And so it becomes very complicated when you talk about, and it's complicated on the prairies. When you talk about land extraction, and you also talk about, how these folks are living day to day. And for Mackenzie, when she leaves and returns home, there's been vast amount of changes that have happened to the territory, because the oil field has gone, has depleted in the area, where when she was living there for the vast portion of her life, it had been really booming. And when she comes back, they've largely moved on to other areas with more land that has like more reserves. So she is faced with, because the land is also a character, and so she comes back to a place where she feels really bad that she doesn't feel she knows this place anymore. And she sees a lot of the hurt that it's gone through and the ways that it is different and the ways that she's reflecting on the ways she's different. And she thinks about these complex relationships with the land and the effect that these industries have had on it, and also within herself. And again, it's hard to talk about it without giving away too much, but it is a big facet of the novel is her coming to terms with that changed relationship and what the land looks and feels like now.
And it's so timely. As I was driving here today, I was listening to CBC Radio, and I don't know if you heard about the First Nations chiefs disrupting the Ontario Parliament today. Did anyone hear about that? No, not yet. Well, it's in the news right now. So if you haven't heard about it yet, you'll hear about it. They were looking for a meeting with the premier, although they weren't looking to beg him to meet with them. They were saying, you should have met with us because you're allowing mining to go on in Northern Ontario, in our territories, and you haven't consulted with us. And so these conflicts are ever present in the lives of Indigenous people. In my territory, we have the world's largest nuclear power plant, Bruce Power. So, this is happening all over, and we're all dealing with the impacts of that kind of extractive way of approaching things as resources. And that goes to all sorts of, as you mentioned earlier, systems, the so-called child welfare system, which is very extractive and, very much sees our children and our families as resources to run their industry. So, that's all part of it. Now, can you tell me just quickly, so it's called Bad Cree. So I'll tell you, because I'm Anishinaabe. So I was reading the book to prepare for this, and I work with Randy Lundy, the poet. He's Cree, Cree poet. And so I was reading it, so I posted a message to him on Facebook, and I was like, I'm reading this book by Jessica called Bad Cree. And I'm like halfway through, so far, no mention of you. What gives? So I'm going to ask you, what gives? Bad Cree. He's not even in there.
Well, I know a lot of Bad Crees, so...
I wasn't sure if he wasn't bad enough or if... No, I'm teasing.
You know what? I don't know Randy well enough to say whether he would make it on the bad list. Bad in a good way. I know some badass Crees. So so we'll see. Maybe he'll make it on the list. He's going to have to prove himself bad.
We're looking for the sequel. Ever Bad Cree.
I was thinking about how great it would be to make a whole series and just go Sad Cree, Rad Cree, Dad Cree, which will just be about a Cree dad doing Cree dad stuff. So wait for it. Yeah, it'll come.
I'm looking forward to that one. I'm going to hold you to that. So thank you so much.